So I think without further ado, I'll introduce Sally Caves right here. Sally Caves, aka Sarah Higley, used to be closeted, but is no longer. She was outed at work, and she's actually quite well known on Conlanger, and great person, great language, which perhaps she'll tell us a little bit about. Oh yes, okay. And I think I'll leave it to you.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Oh, look at that. Oh. These are some of my little drawings and cutouts up here that I'll put on the table later on. And I'm trying to get into bookmaking. This is a draft. And I have a map. Sur la Mondia. All right. The title of my talk, shall I sit down? Yes. The title of my talk is The Medium and the Internet Conlanger. Vision, Venue, and Play. Utuvia Harimri. I'm very happy to be here. Iriatir Ferimbi, and I'm very grateful. And I'm very thankful that my sister's over here, who outed me about having cats. Darn her. So I guess that will need some explanation later, but I'm going to ignore it for the moment. The first thing I must say is to thank and congratulate Cy Emrys for putting this lovely conference together. Let's give it. And not only that, so quickly, so impressively, and so professionally, within 3 months. I'm glad that he's making this talk available to others by video, in a sense extending the conference. But as some of this comes from my book, Under Scrutiny, it is pro forma for the uptight humanist for me to ask that I not be quoted in published form without my permission, please, excepting the video. But I'm also wearing the hat of a conlanger, and I can speak more freely here about what I think it is that I'm doing with Teonath, or what you're doing, not with Teonath. I took several years to write a book about conlanging, and it turned into a book on Hildegard of Bingen's Lingua Ignota, as it is seen in context with later language inventions. And some of you might know my online article published in 2000 in MC, a journal of media and culture, Audience, Euglossia, and Conlang. They were completely flummoxed by it, but they published it anyway. It emphasized media, which is part of my message today. Without our medium, we could not be doing what we're doing so efficiently. So you're doing that Tolkien-y stuff. This is whenever I say I'm inventing a language. Oh, like Tolkien. What I've been trying to combat for years is the sense that what we all do is corny, unscholarly, nerdy, not geeky, nerdy, not fit for the subject of a respectable academic venue, our medium too new, smacking too much of self-publication, or just copying Tolkien. Now, Tolkien rocks, right? But we are so post-Tolkien. Partly because of our media. My précis, printed on Ellen's lovely website, asks why it is that Hildegard of Bingen was lauded for her language invention in the 12th century, whereas Hélène Smith, the famous Swiss medium of the late 19th century, was not. So of course, medium, i.e. crystal ball gazer, and medium, i.e. internet, recorded conferences, etc., are notions I want to put together. Smith became famous because she was scrutinized by psychologist Théodore Fournoy, who remarked in his book on her, another medium, that her Martian language, or Espagnol, was a puerile calque of French. Her invented letters from that language were a result of graphomotor hallucinations. Her trances in which she received this and other languages were displays of somnambulism, dream, altered state, pathology, and her mediumistic transformations into Marie Antoinette and other famous dead personages were a result of play acting, and essentially childish and regressive. And yet here's a woman who, while she listened to the whisperings of Astenay, her ambassador from Mars, and not the whisperings of God himself, was a medium, new meaning, as was Hildegard, for the transference for a foreign language, a foreign script, presumably without conscious effort. Now one wonders how Hildegard may have been dissected had she lived in the 19th century. It didn't help that Dr. Salmanazar in the 18th century and Mary Baker in the 19th century pretended Salmanazar to have studied Formosan, that was Salmanazar's invented language, or Mary Baker being a princess from a foreign land and wandering around the country and speaking an unknown language, for which she got quite a bit of attention and status. Such hoaxers, Salmanazar and Baker. Such women, Baker and Smith. Indecorous, ostentatious, publicity-seeking, play-acting, immodest, and immature. So I answer myself. Hildegard lived and wrote in an age that valued the pre-Babylonian language, the language of Adam and Eden, the word of God, the original uncorrupted Hebrew lost to the world. In her day, language was considered invented if it had any worth. Okay, Adam naming the animals, witness the Cratylus, and Socrates' answer to Hermogenes. Only the nomothete, the lawgiver, can be the onomatourge or word maker. Gadol Glass invented Irish from 72 languages in the Book of the Invasions. For Hildegard, there was no model of insanity or hoax, only the Montanists, but that was centuries ago. No Smith, no Tolkien, no Mary Baker, to which she could be compared. Rather, Adam naming the animals, the apostles at Pentecost. And since she wrote all her fiery works under the influence of the living light, her unknown language and letters were praised in her Vita and mentioned among her miracles in the Acta Inquisitiones. She was lauded. A demonstration of her language is preserved in one antiphon or hymn, a dedication to O Ortskis Ecclesia, O Ortskis Church, O probably immense church. And in a list of over 1,000 words preserved in 2 manuscripts, Wiesbaden and Berlin. The only known use of her accompanying literae ignoti is demonstrated in the Zwiefaltener Codex at Stuttgart. Right. She became posthumously known as a prophet who was able to read and interpret secret and divine writings. Hélène Smith, on the other hand, lived in an age that was dominated by Freud. At the end of the 19th century, with the rise of Pentecostalism and the interest taken in glossolalia, hysteria, hypnosis, hyper and cryptomnesia, automatic writing, the unconscious, and the deliciously mysterious mentality of the female medium became a special area of study for the subliminal psychologist. In the early to mid-20th century, language invention fell under their scrutiny. The language philosophers of the 17th century were derided, especially by Marina Gagello, a household term on Conlanger, Marina, who called them fous du langage, not a term original to her, but one that we now associate with her, fools for language. Look at the lunatic sitting in his study. In the mid to late 20th century, most scholarly books have been devoted to auxiliary language invention, but also to what Umberto Eco calls glottomaniacs. I seriously wonder if Tolkien's shy attitude, expressed in A Secret Vice, about his language invention, taken to complex levels that we don't see in his novels, was a result of living in an era that regarded language creation as mad and effeminate. And yet such invention was curiously prevalent. His encounter with the fellow recruit, as you all know, in the Great War, a famous passage in A Secret Vice, a man who announced, "Yes, I shall express this, the accusative with a prefix," and then he was closed up like an oyster, a smile on his face that expressed the delight, said Tolkien, that an artist feels at finding the result line for his composition. This is evidence that inventing a personal language may have been far more common than outsiders think. But because they were kept secret, we can't gauge their numbers until now on the internet. And even then, we're probably just the tip of the iceberg. Paradoxically, Tolkien is shut out of scholarly scrutiny largely because his work is too sane. What fascinates scholars is the language distortion of schizophrenics, clang associations, echolalia, a new book just published about that last year, word salads, weird neologisms, or poetic flights of verbal invention found in Finnegan's Wake. Poet and word creator Antonin Artaud had this to say about Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky. I never liked this poem. I do not like poems or languages of the surface which smell of happy leisures and intellectual success. As if the intellect relied on the anus, but without any heart or soul in it. Meaning must have value in itself. That is, it must issue from torment. End quote. I wonder what he'd say about Tolkien. Tolkien's languages, I surmise, do not receive the mention by Yagello, Schnapp, or Rassel and McCaffrey for I think the same reasons. Too sane, too indicative of happy leisures, or as Gilles Deleuze puts it, quote, too well bred. The invented languages that interest are brothers to misery and insanity. Insanity, if I didn't say that loud enough. Insanity. Lewis Wolfson and his autobiographical Les Schizo et les Langues continually referred to. Interestingly, he was an American who conceived a revulsion for his own language and did all he could to forget it. And yet we all know that Tolkien was no stranger to misery. What Lord of the Rings says indirectly about World War I has been much examined. Now, I've been working on my Teonoth for 40 plus years. I may be insane, but Teonoth is not. It's very well bred. It did not issue out of misery. I cannot speak it fluently, alas. It remains a literary language. And I imagine that the rest of your inventions are well bred too. My lunatic survey, started in 1998 and repeated 18 million times, was meant to get some idea from all of you how you came to invent, how you regarded your invention, what your structural and aesthetic preferences were. And one important question that so many of you evaded was the sexuality, the sensuality, and the spirituality of what you're doing. Your evasions indicated that there was little sense of the anus in your language, but I might be wrong. That you did not invent to name your private parts, or at least you didn't admit to that. Schnapp says that neologisms for one's private parts abound, and that they're demonstrated in Hildegard's long list of the Crocrotile. What nonsense. I mean, she was copying the taxonomy of a Latin, German, Sumerian, and it had the same thing. Your work did not issue from torment, and you weren't diviners. Your inventions did not participate very much in some religious charisma, but were conscious, interested projects that you did for delight. Shame on you. Torment. Here is a private answer to my question and a nice antidote to Artodian misery. The enunciating of the sentences, the coining of words for new thoughts and feelings as you need them, the conversations held in one's head, or the dog if he's up to it, the books and dictionaries and little pieces of paper, the act of writing out the dictionary by hand like a cloistered monk. It's both romantic and baroque. It's like living in one's own Rococo painting, 24 hours a day. Anonymous, I'm sorry, this can't go on there. It's like living in one's own Rococo painting. Not God's, not that of the Martians, one's own. What Hildegard couldn't acknowledge because she received her gifts from the Lord. What Hélène Smith could not admit to because she was, after all, a medium. You have been able to declare, because of the age we live in, that you do it on your own, that we do it on our own. We have a different way today of conceiving of inspiration and invention. What for Hildegard was divine visio, and her picture in the now lost Rupertsberg manuscript shows her sitting in her chamber, writing on a wax tablet while the flames of the living light stream down upon her head. We call that creativity. But I wanted to ask you, does vision exist today? What is a visionary today? To be inspired is to be breathed into by a divinity. Will anyone admit in this room there is something that seizes you in inventing, in painting, in composing music, in writing fiction, in conceiving of an unknown culture, and in inventing an unknown language that is outside of yourself, that has been breathed into you? Many of you, as the day goes by, will talk about structure. I want to quote something from one of my favorite writers, Dean Pascal, in his famous short story, Moriah. Quote, "Passion is a function of time," end quote. The story juxtaposes the passion of the moment to the scientific passion of investigation. At least that's one of its layers. Structure, Idificium system is a passionate undertaking, and part of its passion and its meaning for us is that it unfolds over time. It is not glossolalia, what we do. The passion is something that seizes us in the moment. It's something we know will never quite be finished. How far is our development, you know? Never. That may be part of its appeal. I'll return to this idea in a minute, but not until I've gone over a more commonplace notion that I'm putting in my book, the ability for adults to play today. Noir characterized Smith's malady as a regression into child's play. As adults, we are not to regress. In his book, The Ambiguity of Play, Brian Sutton Smith asks why it is we assume that only children play, whereas adults engage in recreation. Quote, this is him, "If one still assumes that children's play is about general adaptation, growth, and development, then what are the reasons for adult play? Erickson, in 1956, one of the few to even consider the matter, has suggested that while the child goes forward in his play, the adult goes sideways. This apparently means that children are growing up while they are playing and adults are not. Presumably, adults have already..." I didn't think about that sideways until just now. "Presumably," he continues, "adults have already grown up, so the supposed growth virtues of play are irrelevant. If play is a preparation for maturity," says Gross in 1976, "then what are the mature doing when they play? Are they preparing for death? Perhaps they're not preparing for anything." End quote. Sutton Smith then contests the widespread assumption that play must work towards some kind of progress, such that adult playing instead of recreating should be considered a regression. This is what he's defined. He gives 5 levels on a scale of development that have been proposed by theorists. 1, the inability to play, such as when one is under terrible stress or mental illness. 2, play as pathology, such as dangerous obsessions and risk-taking. 3, play as a form of security, quote, typical of what have been called low players, persons who are anxious or aggressive in their expressive behavior and confine themselves to repetitive and minimally expressive forms of play, end quote, which I imagine would be something like crossword puzzles or chess. 4, chess by yourself. Yeah. 4, play as stereotypic, such as games that have rigid rules like team or spectator sports. And 5, playful forms of play, not a helpful rubric. Sort of tautological. Playful forms of play. The 5th is more complex and involves a high degree of creativity, wherein the players are, quote, able to convert their own playful characteristics into play scenarios for others, end quote. You can see where I'm going with this. Such play demands flexibility, and his quote, and he has, quote, excuse me, I can't read my own writing, the greatest potential for transfer and adaptability, by which Sutton Smith means that it can change from play into a non-ludic occupation. In this respect, I must add, art can be a kind of play in what people may engage in, that people may engage in it avocationally, right? But it becomes a serious vocation when it goes professional, providing further professional artists for non-artists when it's observed, obsessed, and argued over in public venues. Try this. Joke or storytelling, the playful banter of inventive, imaginative, rhetorically powerful people, like those of you speaking on the speaker over there, who in their quips allow other people to quip in return, who in their stories allow other people to interpret, and who provide the means for other people to reciprocate creatively. This is a creative play scenario for others. Prior to the internet, role-playing games allowed adults to play in ways that were once considered the domain of children. On the internet, live journals, blogs, and message boards encourage playful... Yes, exactly. Live journals, blogs, and message boards can encourage playful transference among adults. Where, then, does inventing a language fall within this scale of development that Sutton Smith has offered? Is it always playful? If we skip the first and take the second category, we have plenty of instances in which distortions of language are pathological. Clang association in schizophrenic and other cognitive disorders put a high premium on the phonic resemblance of certain words at the expense of their meanings. One might ask a patient, for instance, about her meds, and she may respond that the meds lost. I stole that from House MD. Right. Distortions of language, word salads, echolalia, the inability to speak unless it's rhymed, remember the play David and Lisa, are associated with schizophrenia or autism, the assumption being that they exhibit an inability to respond in socially appropriate discourse, allowing the patient to hide. Because of its apparent loss of ego identity, as some have described it, glossolalia is painted with the brush of lunacy by some people and subjected to psychological inquiry. But that's a fraught issue, and I'm not going to go into it. So, is language invention, the stuff that we do, obsessive? Especially if conducted in private or without a suitable social or intellectual venue? Is it a product of the low player, one who prefers to play her games by herself, writing in diaries, and one keeps secret from one's siblings and one's parents? Interestingly, there is a new program that I read about on April issue of the Vocabula Review side called Design Your Own Language. Writer Amalia Gnadadesikan writes that, quote, "Someday, perhaps you'll be able to find it among the software programs at the store next to SimCity, the ultimate language architect simulator game." The words valid linguistic principles, she writes, are written on the package. Now, from what little I've read about it, because I couldn't get into the articles, you have to pay to get in there, and they wouldn't let me in. From what little I've read about it, the game seems to target individuals, but it also suggests that inventing language has entered the rumor mill, has become folkloric. It's not surprising, we're all over the internet. In fact, the best information about what we do, about conlanging, is on the internet, and not just in English. I surmise that this game, if it is ever sold or exists, is not aimed at bringing people together, though, as do sports, unless it's been inspired by role-playing. So I will assert, however, that the last two categories of Brian Sutton Smith's list here, stereotypic and transferability of play, are becoming more applicable to 20th century glossopoeia, especially as it's developed digitally. So this is what I discovered when I read from you. This is what I discovered when I found all of you. Prior to Conlang, in 1998, I would have described myself as a low player, hiding behind my language invention in my teens in order to avoid dating, doing homework, or playing volleyball. Later, when I was still working on it as a professor, and without Design Your Own Language, or even Line Maker, I would have labeled myself seriously obsessive. It went along, however, with the delight I took in drawing little maps of unknown towns, unknown countries, making elaborate miniatures of unknown houses out of cardboard, and I found that this is a predilection among some of you as well. I felt, as Tolkien expressed it in a letter, that I should stop doing it, but oh, I love it so. I managed to marry, which was good, despite my low playing in the academic fortress I live in, but it was you who made me understand that this activity was a complex form of adult play, and that there was a venue for it. It's just that I was outside the game room, thinking that what I was doing was terribly unique or pathological. The internet has become a medium and a venue for discussing, describing, displaying in graphic, visual, and oral form a very human, and I dare say, widespread type of invention. Since I started talking openly about it, I've met a number of students who said they were doing the same thing, having never heard of Conlang. One of them, Doug Mall, okay, who was my student, Rochester, who took an independent study from me and Jeff Runner with his Scare, or Scare. That was fun. Just look at this pursuit of ours. We confer and interact with each other with an ease unknown by previous media. We ask for and give advice, comment on linguistic information, argue heatedly about what we're doing, and share aspects of our own language inventions, all of which lead to forms of transformation, and I would suggest maturation. I learned more about other than historical linguistics from Conlang than I ever did here at Berkeley. Pache. No, I learned about Chomsky. Ilbethasad is a community of conlangers who've constructed an alternate universe, participation in which requires considerable knowledge of history, current events, and language. We're not going sideways, we're going forward, honing our skills and our inventions. We borrow words from one another. My shameless borrowing is meavalth from the Drosselic word for gull, and it morphed into regimentation, you know, the way the gulls all face one direction in the wind. I might ask to borrow Kemet from Matt Pearson, but only with his permission. It is a wonderful word. Complicated, swirling around, things that swirl around. Like leaves, birds. We have Jeffrey Henning to thank for publicizing on his extensive LineMaker webpages a popular and significant translation challenge, Genesis 11:1-9, the Tower of Babel, which has eventually become our flag. Where to go? All right. And our t-shirt, our mascot. We have Irina Arendt, author of Valdean, for starting in 1998 the first Conlanger translation relay, the Starling Song, based on the old childhood game telephone. Such an exercise certainly participates in Sutton Smith's playful forms of play, engaging not only literal transference and real ambiguity, but active involvement of one conlanger with another's conlang. No longer can Yagello say it's easy for a speaker inventing a language to create its vocabulary, but extremely difficult to escape from the syntactic straitjacket of his or her native language. Now, obviously she's talking here about mediumistic conlangers like Smith. I love this remark though. The fou du langage is in love with language while remaining ignorant of the science of language. We're not doing this. Configuration, affiliation, and perspective. John Quijada. A large proportion of you are linguists finding new terminology. The translation relay will only morph if our languages are complex and original enough to make the recipient make mistakes, unusual enough and culturally different enough so that concepts in one language don't easily translate into another. I had a challenging time following Arte's lovely Ashail and her empathic pronouns. What we are not doing is making calques of French. Rather, I find that many of us are interested in linguistic engineering and that making innovative structure is the passion and the patient, tedious production of vocabulary is the challenge. Many of us produce new inventions as new ideas occur to us, and many of us stick to one language and revise it, grinding a slow mill. This process, since Tolkien, has been sped up by the computer. Marshall McLuhan famously said, "The medium is the message." It shapes how we communicate our passions, even dictating their form. Hildegard had her monks and nuns record her visions in manuscript, and they became lost to posterity until discovered again in earnest only in the last 200 years. Hélène Smith was lucky to have Théodore Flournoy because he became the major medium of the medium's ambassador. Her writings, her voices, her alphabets, her extraordinarily beautiful and naive paintings of Espagnier and its houses and its carriages and its inhabitants were replicated in his book. Tolkien had the novel to record his Conworld, along with some of his language and conscripts, and later Peter Jackson to extend it in film form. But the internet is the ideal venue for the kind of thing that we are doing, and it helps create how we think of inventing. Digital technology allows us to erase something in an instant, to erect a monument in a matter of days. Randomizers allow us to create vocabulary from basic morphemes. Audio systems allow us to record our recitations and songs. We have font-making software. I showed this to you, didn't I? Yeah. Where am I? Here's a font that was made for me by Richard Brody from Hildegard's Ignota Lingua, a lingua ignota. Extraordinarily ugly script, I think. Look at fifth, and its immense vocabulary. I was blown away. Hildegard's manuscripts were not easily accessible to the public at large in the way the internet is, and yet the internet, while being obviously visible to those with computers, it is also invisible by its very nature and vastness. It is visible in that anybody can have access to it. Anybody can join our listserv or read the archives. And it is invisible because there are a jillion other websites out there to distract the non-conlangers. This conference is a medium as well, and that is being recorded. But we have to decide that going mainstream is what we want, or if that's even possible, or if it can ever reach consumers besides ourselves. Design your own language, as I said, seems targeted at the individual, but what do I know? I couldn't read the rest of it. These things, wrote Tolkien, were constructed deliberately to be personal. By its very nature, inventing a language is strange, don't you think? You can't just dip into a conlang as you can dip into a dollhouse or a Broadway show. Those who don't write operas can still enjoy them. Those who don't paint can look at a landscape, no matter how stylized or abstracted, and see in it rivers, cows, graveyards, orchids, genitalia. You can't just look into a conlang and see in it these things, this poetry, without learning it. Its beauty, for those overhearing it, resides in its opacity, its alterity. Its subtleties and significances, even for us who share them, will always remain essentially private. In a way, then, we are still closeted, because the internet, as open as it is, can enclose people in pockets of specialization. I'm glad, though, that design your own language, even if it's a pipe dream, seems to recognize a growing trend. Inventing a language has had implications as well, to those who don't do this kind of thing, of pointlessness and arrogance, because natural language is immense. Next to tool making, and it's our oldest technology. It is developed over millennia by consensus, and its primary function, for most people who aren't poets, is to get things done. How arrogant, said one of my colleagues when I told him about inventing a language, about Teonaw, meaning that I had arrogated to myself an impossible and useless task that humanity had already taken care of more efficiently. Wilhelm Grimm in 1848 and Bertha Wiedmer in 1955 simply couldn't assign the lingua ignota to Hildegard because of its seeming pointlessness, Sinnlosigkeit. Why would a mystic do anything so weird? Plowshare, Zigens, prostitute, Malvitia, curly hair, Ornitziris, archbishop, Aretzinfolians, Holy Spirit, Isparitz, glowworm, Kantia. As Peter Dranka put it, her language is relentlessly sublunary. Most of it is basically devoted to things that one can touch, and there are like 5 words for anything spiritual. Very strange. Her language is primitive compared to most of ours. She had a substantial number of compounds, but many of her words seem pulled from the divine air, or a mimicry of the Latin or German word she was creating. Divelitz, for the German word devil. Oyer, from Latin, ora, for ear. She had only nouns, though her antiphon exhibits 3 adjectives. I said I wasn't going to talk about Hildegard, but here I am. Hildegard had Latin and the Latin-German dictionaries or Sumeria to help her arrange her language in a list. And yet there is an uncanny resemblance, I think. An uncanny resemblance to a lot of what we do. We were exposed to Spanish or Latin, like Doug, or Esperanto, like David. And we had grammar books as guides. Hildegard set her language down in a taxonomy, because that's how the Sumeria was ordered. Sumerium. God's world, the human world, human body parts, human diseases, ecclesiastical offices, parts of the church. We display our language in a strict order established by the grammars we've consulted. Phonology, always first. Morphology, nouns first. Hildegard had an alphabet, so do many of us. Hildegard demonstrated her lingua in a soundbite. O orskis ecclesia, a dedication to a church. What most of us don't do, and I'm waiting to be surprised, is claim that our language is given to us by God as a kind of charisma. We are at the center of our creations. But I will let you in on a little secret. My first writings in Teonaw were prayers and charms that had more force than anything I could say in English, because they were expressed in invented words that had intense and spiritual meaning for me. A good number of my Teonaw writings to this day have some kind of spiritual or philosophical import. The Gospel of Lastet, the List of Gods and Angels, the Miquid and Dolacra. I have several erotic poems. I'm not going to share those with you. One inspired by a challenge basically issued by Baudouin Rent and his Den Den brothel songs. But I understand that they emerge out of me, and my interest is well in fantasy and science fiction, in the otherworldly, the exotic. I was quite pleased to hear from a reverend who joined a list a few weeks ago. You might remember Paul, a few weeks in 2003, that's what I meant to say, Reverend Paul Burgess, and who wrote his Manasipri Salama, or Celestial Labors, in his long-lived Hermetic, or Manapanantha, with superb illustrations. Is his inspiration? Is it vision, creativity? My question on the surveys was to spirit out any response to you on this matter, but I think it is a highly personal question. and a complex one that involves how we examine the slow labor we do that is a kind of sustained passion. So let me conclude with another question. How our sense of an aesthetic contributes to our love of language creation. I know we've had debates online about whether language creation is a craft or an art form or a hobby. Since art is so hard to define, I'm in a quandary. Perhaps we can debate it later, but it brings me back to this issue of play. Sutton Smith's ambiguity is that adult play, adult recreation, can evolve or give rise to activities not considered recreative, like what we do, no matter how passionate, to put bread on the table. Inventing a language can lead to lots of money if you're Mark Okrand, and involve a lot of other people in play acting in Klingon. Most of us who are language inventors don't have that in our stars, with the exception of Matt Pearson. And our art langs can really only be admired, non-lucratively, by our fellow art langers. The word craft, too, is difficult because when I think of craft, I think of consumable items like bronze Celtic belt buckles that you get at the Renaissance Fair. And yet, isn't that what we're doing, a high form of craft work? Who are the consumers of an invented language besides Paramount? Hobby is playful. Maybe that's what we're doing. Comparing what we do to models or miniatures is equally contentious. Many conlangers object to the notion that inventing a language is making a miniature language, given its breadth of vocabulary that is a model of a known language. I prefer to suggest that what we create are pretend languages, in the way that a character in a novel is a pretend person, with all the depth and history hinted at of a real person. And yet pretense carries with it the connotation of deceit. You can't win. Hildegard would never say that she was pretending. The conscious, complete reordering of language as recreation has profound implications. The recreation of new words is not arrogant or meaningless. It participates frequently in a similar joy taken in invented worlds, cities, detailed maps of invented ocean liners, customs, spaceships, a desire almost to make a bird's eye view of something both familiar and foreign at the same time, something immense that we control. It's been described as a kind of poetry that engages a private aesthetic. That is even harder to pin down because what we consider aesthetic in our languages isn't a word personal, which is why it's still too soon to start handing out prizes for the best conlang. Tolkien suggested that maybe that would be in the future. For some, it's the system and its efficiency, its originality. For others, it's the sound of the words, the look of the script, Sylvia's astonishing box script, and her bold violation of a linguistic universal. I have admired and envied other conlangs, Tio's Tatari Fara and its originality, Matt's beautiful Takana, its limited phonology and its efficiency. I wonder, Matt, actually, what you think of Le Guin's Kesh, since it's also set in an alternate California. We'll talk about that later. John Quijada's 25-year project on a logical, philosophical, creative language is cool. I can only speak for myself, though, when I describe what I find aesthetically pleasing. I was never so delighted when I hit upon volitionality and non-volitionality, or earlier when I devised the law of detachability that allowed tense and aspect suffixes to prefix pronouns. I had a great deal of fun devising the deictic prepositions with all their, e's, aris, and andis. I'm not so sure I like Taylor's OSV structure anymore, which is cumbersome and impossible to think in. So I devised a less formal SOV structure with the resumptive pronoun because the final verb must have a verb in front, a pronoun in front of it or a subject in front of it. I have always wanted my language to be difficult and baroque, a rococo world I inhabit. I wanted to suggest it had many borrowings from other alien languages, but I didn't want to figure it out. And exceptions to the rule, that was important. So here is a list of words I made that I wrote down first. I had a whole book of just words that I pulled out of the air, and then assigned meanings to. You're going to laugh at me for this. My language creation, having rudiments in puberty, was unsophisticated and still is to an extent, because the word has to sound like what it means in some deeply, indescribably subjective way. Hwinder, which became wine. Mender, which became corridor. Ulder, which became hush, that which has been turned to silence. Fipil, branch. Morphip, bottle, something you have to pop open with a bottle opener. Morphip. Pundle, which became cushion, because maybe it sounded like bundle, I don't know. Wendel, which became child. Actually, I found the word for the concept. Fistery, which became bowel. Don't ask me why. Fistery. Feprid, which became a false history, a tall tale. Spifife, I don't know yet. Poufine, the sound of something shattering, maybe because it sounds like poof. Mescot, don't know yet. Escoat, which became shadow. Man, which became bread. Clado, don't know, some kind of gadget, maybe a shaft on a wagon. Ray, rapa, finger toe, because the tongue has to point backwards. Ray, rapa. I'm still doing in some ways what Hildegard did so long ago, despite the other rigors I subjected Teanoth to, pulling things out of the not-so-divine air. I go for unusual initial clusters, closed syllables, a predilection for K sounds, Hrefemort, a foul word that escapes and humiliates you, but also a reproach from others who hear it. Hrefemort. This one is a combination of Kref, grip, which also became fist, and Mora, mouth. Fist slapped to mouth. I like dark consonants, R and L drawn back in the mouth, far la rope, an object hurled in fury, but also the person hit by the object. I like liquids too, especially as they represent, elevated or spiritual concepts. Earlom God, Eldermed angel, Erchen Nachil, paradise, Veloreo, fairy, ghost, wraith, invented person. Aililelio, indescribable. Call me a folle du langage. Passion is a function of time.
Before you get to leave that table, does anyone have questions? Raise your hand if you do, and anything that you would like.
If, as you say, this is just the tip of the iceberg, and the little group assembled here has a massive something else, floating beneath the surface of the water, that presents a real problem for deciding, ultimately which conlangs you want to spend your considerable time and effort trying to understand and appreciate. So it seems to me, could there be some way of organizing and identifying and categorizing, and perhaps even some sort of peek via audio files at what a particular language sounds like, so that people could have some hope of, because it is such an intense and time-consuming effort to get to the point where you can appreciate even a single language, let alone several or many.
Well, I think the best resource for you is Jeff Henning's Langmaker, where he's tried to do exactly that. I mean, he has immense pages where he catalogs the different conlangs according to whether you just have to navigate his pages. I think that he's done the most in that respect for doing exactly what you have requested. And the other thing is that even though there are only, about 40 people here, we still have the listserv with a number of people commenting on that, directing us to websites. Many people have sound bites, but not enough, not enough. That's difficult to make a sound bite. I mean, you sweat. You're not sure if you're pronouncing your language correctly. You think you have an American accent when you're pronouncing. It's difficult, and also you have to have the equipment for it. And so, yes, there is a vast number, I think, of people out there who are not on the listserv, who have not heard of it, who are doing this in isolation, and doing it in different degrees, some of them only writing. Nancy Stork, my friend in Portola Valley, told me that they know somebody who has a written language, but he incorporates it in his paintings, and he never translates it. So it's private only to him. And I know of people who I can't name, who have contacted me and said, I have invented a language since I was 5. It has deep personal value for me. I can read it, I can speak it, I can think in it, but don't tell anybody. And it is not just Doug Ball, but I have run into people on the street. I did an NPR interview, which was disastrous. But I got contacted by people, 7 people or so across the United States, who said, I do this kind of thing. And the very fact that Tolkien ran into somebody in the war, in the army, suggests that this is a human and natural passion and enterprise. But because of the nature of it, it's so difficult to make it known. And so I'm glad that we have the internet. I'm very glad that we have Langmaker. Have you looked at that, Langmaker?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, but the thing is, people have to contribute to it as well.
I know he's in the process of wikifying.
He's wikified it, he has. And
I can't find anything right now.
now it's gone. Okay, anything else? Anything? Okay, what about the spirituality, sensuality, sexuality question, People get embarrassed about that kind of thing.
Does your husband get to hear your erotic?
Oh, absolutely. How do you think? He's actually contributed to some of the vocabulary.
Actually, I have a question for you, Sally.
Yes.
In your lunatic survey, if I recall correctly, you had a question near the end of it, or maybe a couple of questions that were oriented toward asking everyone's opinion about how or whether this conlanging as a phenomenon should be advertised to the general public in order to garner acceptance, or what the general public's attitude should be, with a sense of, helping to legitimize what we do. And yet, to me, I question whether the more popular this gets, to the point that there's potentially software coming out for Joe Schmo to be able to do this.
Design your
Does
language.
this cheapen our art? Does it turn it into something that's shallow?
Does it banalize it?
Banalize it? And do we lose a sweet sense of elitism or arrogance that we have in this ever less secret vice? I'd like to hear your comments.
The ever less secret vice. I think that had Tolkien lived in our age and seen Conlanger been on the listserv, I think he would have felt quite diminished. I think that part of it, my reaction to Conlang when I got on was, this is fabulous. I'm not unique anymore. How can Thanos compete? But it was also a stimulus to really, really thinking seriously about Thanos and deepening it, sharpening it, adding maniacally to its vocabulary, making that taxonomy, putting up all those web pages in secret that I was keeping from the department, because that would be considered playing. Well, the question I asked was, do we want to go mainstream? I think there is a sense that if a software program comes out called Design Your Own Language, there is a sense that it will become sort of like role-playing, or I'm not saying this very eloquently. I think that we take a pride in the fact that what we're doing is is inaccessible. Jeffrey Henning, however, is the one who wants it to go mainstream. He's the one who has expressed the most intensive desire for it to be recognized publicly and talked about. And so part of what I'm trying to do is write a book about it that will be seen in academic circles, and maybe write an article, or a lot of us can be doing that, that will be in print form instead of on the internet. Because the internet is still seen as a kind of place where you self-publish. And I, for some reason, you know, this is so elitist. If it appears in print form somewhere, that somehow makes it more legitimate. But even then, people might look at that and say, oh yeah, okay, that's interesting, you know, let's look at something else. I don't know if we're ever going to make what we do an astonishing art form to the public. It is an astonishing art form for us. And we can talk about why it is somehow different from painting, from composing, from writing plays. I'd like to see it in a category of artistry and poetry. But also there are aspects of it that, as you talked about earlier, that apply to making language more logical for specific purposes. And for instance, Lojban, you know, a logical language, has all sorts of import for computer technology. There are all sorts of practical applications for it, but for art lines, I think we have to remain in some ways kind of closeted and elite.